Today, I'm reviewing the Ollo Audio R1, a closed-back headphone Ollo positioned specifically for recording and tracking, not mixing. And that distinction matters because Ollo is being unusually blunt about what the R1 is tuned to do. It's not trying to be flat, it's trying to make performers happier in the booth. That alone is somewhat refreshing, not because it is revolutionary, but because it's explicit. Most headphones and their marketing try to pretend you can get studio reference accuracy or fun musical sound or massive soundstage and lifelike holography all at the same time. But in reality, you're always making trade-offs. So this review is going to focus on three things. First, what Ollo is actually selling you: materials, build, modularity, support, things like that. Second, whether the R1 behaves like a practical recording tool. And third, the sound, what it emphasizes, what it masks, and how it compares to two fairly neutral closed-back headphones, well, neutral as is generally accepted among the community. And those two headphones are the Rode NTH100 and the Neumann NDH20. Ollo is a smaller company based in Slovenia, and they've built their reputation in the pro audio headphone niche, not lifestyle consumer hi-fi. If you've been around studio headphone discussions, Ollo's earlier models came up because they leaned into a few practical ideas, such as durable materials, serviceable parts, and consistent production runs rather than flashy annual refresh cycles with new paint jobs. Their earlier product families include the S-Series, models like the S4X and the S4R, both which I previously reviewed years ago, and multiple refinements of those designs over time, such as with the headband and the overall construction. Ollo themselves frame this as an iterative legacy line built around repeated testing and feedback rather than constant reinvention, or maybe hypothetical reinvention like we get from other companies. They also recently announced discontinuation of the S4R, which was their closed-back studio model in that earlier ecosystem. And if you've ever watched any of my older ancient reviews by this point, I really loved the S4R and used that as one of my go-to standard bearers for neutrality. And in fact, that was the headphone I compared against every single other closed-back headphone that was trying to portray itself as a neutral headphone. More recently, Ollo has pushed the X1 as an open-back mixing intended headphone, but the R1 is clearly positioned differently. It's meant for tracking, isolation, click containment, and keeping the performer locked in. On Ollo's own website, they describe the R1 as being tuned intentionally with a U-shaped response to keep sessions feeling energetic, and they explicitly say flat kills the vibe for recording. Whether you agree with that philosophy or not, it's at least honest. The R1 is not being marketed as your final mixing reference. Instead, it's for those who are actually recording in the booth, and maybe they want to have a little bit of fun at the time. The R1's build is basically Ollo doing Ollo things. Real materials, not faux luxury. You're looking at a closed-back design with wood ear cups and a metal headband structure. The immediate practical question is not, does walnut sound better? Because wood doesn't magically improve frequency response. The practical questions are, is it rigid? Is it durable? Does it creak and flex under clamp? And does it survive studio life? On that front, Ollo tends to build hardware that feels like it's meant to be used, not photographed. The hinges and yokes aren't trying to be ultra-light jewelry. The headband system is also built like something you can actually maintain, which leads to the part I care about far more than aesthetic materials: repairability. Most headphone brands quietly rely on the same business model. Pads wear out, cables fail, joints loosen, and eventually you replace the whole unit, or you send it into a company for repair that costs you sometimes as much as a new headphone or half the cost of a very expensive headphone. Ollo's pitch is very much the opposite. They lean into modular ownership. Replaceable ear pads, replaceable cables, accessible parts, and yes, even replaceable drivers. Their store is full of replacement components and service parts for every one of their headphones. And they don't cost an arm and a leg. In fact, if you go on their website and look at the price for a speaker unit for one of their headphones, you'll be shocked. It's not that expensive. This all matters because, and I'll say this as plainly as I can, a great sounding headphone that becomes landfill when a hinge fails is not great. A headphone that can be kept running for years with parts you can order is objectively more valuable to working people than a sealed fashion object. One of my pet peeves is companies who pretend they have a warranty, but in reality, when you look at their so-called warranties, they don't actually warranty anything. And so I'd like to take some time, usually when I talk about big products and big major conglomerations, and discuss their warranty status. And I've done that for a lot of companies in the past. I've mentioned this for Ollo's earlier products, but I think it's worth repeating here now that we're almost 7-8 years down the line. Ollo sells direct and also through some resellers. But if you buy direct, they're unusually aggressive about the purchase terms compared to typical audio boutique brands. They advertise a trial period and a long warranty as part of the product proposition. Now, I'm not going to pretend a warranty proves customer service is good or bad, although it can be an indicator. Warranties are promises on paper. Well, sometimes. Sennheiser's warranties completely suck. Beyerdynamics warranties are gotchas all over the place. And Audeze, Audeze. They give you a warranty at some point and then tell you got to pay for it. What matters is response time, parts availability, and whether support actually solves problems instead of running you through scripted fiction, which is what all the other companies tend to do. But Ollo's product ecosystem is at least designed in a way that makes support easier. If your pads die, you buy pads. It's not that expensive. In fact, you don't even need to buy Ollo's own pads. This is no proprietary system, as we'll talk about. If your cable fails, you can replace the cable. Again, it's not proprietary. You can find other cables if you want from third parties for cheaper if it's more cheap to you locally. If a part wears out, it's not automatically a buy new headphone event. That's the correct direction for pro gear. In fact, that is the correct direction for all gear from audio companies. Because let's be honest, these audio companies are not creating groundbreaking items. The things that they do make don't really cost all that much to make. Ollo describes the R1 as having a U-shaped frequency response. That's what I talked about, probably 7 or 8 minutes ago now. Meaning that bass and treble levels are elevated relative to the mid-range. This tuning approach is not new, it's not novel, and it's definitely not experimental. It has existed for decades in consumer and prosumer headphones, most visibly popularized by products like Beats Studio headphones and subsequently replicated by many other manufacturers. In fact, if you're a fan of the Harman Target, you might be somewhat reminded that, that's what basically the Harman Target is. More bass and a little bit more treble, U-shape. The practical effect of a U-shaped response is well understood. Low frequency bands are reproduced at a higher relative level than mid-range fundamentals. High frequency bands are reproduced at a higher relative level than mid-range fundamentals. And the mid-range content remains present but is comparatively lower in level due to contrast, not necessarily because it is physically recessed. In other words, it's not like the mids are purposefully tuned lower per volume, but instead that the other two ranges, the bass and the treble, is just a little bit elevated in comparison. This kind of tuning does not require speculation about energy or vibe or engagement to describe. Its consequences are predictable and measurable, and quite frankly, you've been through it all the time. Every time you pull out an EQ on your phone or on your computer, aren't you adjusting bass more often than not? And also the treble? You're basically creating what this headphone does. So let's talk a little bit about what my experience was using some popular songs. For example, Daft Punk's Lose Yourself to Dance. Great song, huh? And great for bass too, by the way. On this track, the kick drum fundamental and bass line energy is roughly between 50 and 90 hertz generally, and are reproduced at a higher relative level than the mid-range content on the R1. Compared to a neutral reference headphone, the R1 increases the amplitude of low frequency components relative to vocal and harmonic mid-range elements. So in other words, yes, the bass is higher on the R1 than on, say, a neutral headphone, like, for example, the NTH100. Now, two observable behaviors I think are important here. First, the bass occupies more of the perceived loudness budget than would on a flatter headphone. And this isn't an opinion, this is the defining characteristic of a U-shaped response, obviously. And then the other thing is that the elevated low frequencies increase the likelihood of masking lower mid information. So imagine somewhere, say, around 150 hertz to 300 hertz. Now, whether this masking is problematic depends on the listener's task, but the mechanism itself is not subjective. In other words, it actually does happen. So what this really translates to is that sometimes elements in the 150 to 300 hertz range, in that mid-information, will sometimes sound as if they're not audible enough or they're not clear enough because of that increased bass presence. And so if you are looking for information in that particular trough, the 150 to 300, you may have a more difficult time hearing it on the R1 compared to another headphone that just is more linear, that's a little bit more flat, that doesn't have the bass emphasis of the R1. So, I repeated this sort of test on Billie Eilish's Bad Guy. Now, this track contains short, well-defined low-frequency events. On the R1, the onset and offset of bass notes remain distinguishable, meaning you could, and I could, tell the difference, indicating that the bass boost is not accompanied by an excessive low-frequency ringing or prolonged decay. So, in other words, the bass emphasis appears to be level bass rather than resonance bass. Now, so imagine this. You're listening to a track, you're hearing the bass, and instead of a long reverberation of that bass, you hear more elevated bass, like it's louder to you, not that it lasts longer. And there is a pretty significant difference between the two. Bass that has longer reverberation, that tends to last longer, tends to then also bleed into other elements and that pop up right after or alongside. So it masks those other elements in a different way than, say, bass that just tends to be a little bit louder. Now, this distinction matters because level increase changes balance while excessive resonance changes time behavior. And, time behavior has to do with the other components meeting and et cetera, et cetera. It's the science. Now, the mid-range, in my opinion, throughout all my experiments with these tracks is, just as I would have expected from a U-shaped headphone design. So in Norah Jones's Don't Know Why, the mid-range on the R1 remained intact in terms of, being able to hear it. I mean, it's there, it's just not as loud as the other two components of the track, such as the bass and the treble. The vocals and all that other stuff in the 300 to 2 kilohertz range are pretty much audible, and they don't distort, and they're not obscured by the other elements. They're just a little bit less prevalent than on, say, a more neutral headphone like the NTH100 and the NDH20. Now, relative to the elevated bass and treble, the mid-range content occupies a smaller portion of the total loudness that you perceive than it would on the neutral headphone. And this is a contrast effect, not necessarily a literal dip, like you're pulling back the mids and not allowing them to be heard at all. It's just that the other two components here, the bass and the treble, it's just a little bit louder. The result is that vocals and mid-range instruments are reproduced at a lower relative prominence compared to low-frequency elements and high-frequency elements. And, I tried this again on Fleetwood Mac's Dreams, and on this track, the vocal sits behind the kick and the hi-hat in terms of relative level more than it would on a neutral reference. And this doesn't mean that the vocal is unclear or recessed in an absolute sense. It just means that the extremes of the spectrum draw more attention due to their higher amplitude. So once again, the trough, the mid-range, it's not that it's pulled back on purpose. It's just that the other two significant portions, the bass and the treble, are louder. And so you just can't hear the mid as clearly or as loudly, more accurately, you can't hear it as loudly as the other two extremes. Now, as far as treble is concerned, I tried it on Steely Dan's Aja, just try to pay more attention between the 8 and 12 kilohertz range. And what I found is that the R1 does in fact reproduce at a higher relative level between 8 and 12 kilohertz than the mid-range content. And that was consistent when I compared against the NDH100 or NTH100 and the NDH20. These headphones all sound the same after a while. Cymbal transients and sticks and attacks are more prominent compared to neutral monitoring headphones than on the R1. And I think there are a couple of points worth really kind of delving into a little bit. Now, the treble emphasis that I heard appears relatively broad rather than dominating by a single narrow resonance. So it's not like there's a giant spike at the 5 kilohertz and everything else is more smooth. So what ends up happening is that on the R1, it's not like there's a sharp pinprick sound in my ear from a treble spike, say at 5 or 6 or 4 kilohertz, but instead it's a relatively broad, dominated emphasis of treble, but there's a reduced likelihood of a sharp frequency-specific sibilance. And I try to compare it against sibilance-heavy headphones and IEMs, and my go-to is, for better or worse, the Austrian audio headphones that have pretty significant treble increase. In some instances, they can sound pretty sibilant. Compare that to the R1, the sibilance is not nearly the same, and so you can't walk away from sibilance altogether from the R1. I think it's still present, and in my test, probably by 2 decibels, roughly speaking, in my own estimation, compared to a more neutral sounding headphone like the Rode or the Neumann. But it's not as quite sibilant and definitely not as piercing as you would find it on the Austrian audio headphones or some of Beyerdynamics headphones like the DT900 series. Now, the other thing I want to touch on real quick is that because the treble is elevated, high-frequency transients draw more attention than mid-range body, and this is nothing unusual given that it's a U-shaped signature. And just like with the bass that draws more attention because there's louder bass presence, the treble also draws a similar type of attention away from the mid-range. Okay, so the R1's tuning produces 3 predictable outcomes. Low frequency is larger, louder. And high frequency is, again, larger or louder. And the mid-range remains, present. It's there, but is comparatively de-emphasized due to contrast, meaning the other 2 extremes are louder than the mid-range, which might make you feel that the mid-range is just not present enough. And, well, yeah, that is true, because you got a bass emphasis and you got a treble emphasis. And this is inherent of a U-shaped tuning. In fact, put on any other U-shaped headphone or IEM, and you'll get a very similar experience. You can do that to neutral headphones right now by just pulling up your EQ band and adjusting, say, 3 decibels in the bass and 3 decibels or 4 decibels in the treble, and you'll very quickly understand what I'm talking about. So, after doing all of this, I thought it was worth going back and comparing a little bit more closely to the NTH100 from Rode, because that is one of my favorite headphones. I love that headphone. I have 2 of them. And quite frankly, if you want a closed-back neutral headphone for relatively cheap, the NTH100 is a no-brainer. So how does that compare to the more expensive and, more luxurious R1? Luxurious only because it's made of all wood. There are a couple of key differences, I think. For the bass, the NTH100 has less low-frequency elevation relative to the mid-range. So as a result, the bass occupies a smaller portion of the loudness, reducing the likelihood of, the low frequency running over the mid-range. So the bass on the NTH100 is definitely not as prevalent as on the R1. The mid-range is more obvious relative to the bass treble than it is on the R1. And the vocal fundamentals, the mid-range instruments occupy a more central position in the overall balance. So the mid-range on the NTH100 actually sound shoulder to shoulder to the other elements, such as drums and guitars, etc. And maybe on some occasions, maybe a step ahead. So they shine more obviously. They appear to be more prevalent. Then there's a treble, and quite frankly, the NTH100 treble is really restrained. And this is one of the things I pointed out when I reviewed the NTH100 when it first came out. The treble is really easy to listen to on this headphone. The R1, in comparison, may sound a little bit too sharp for some people, especially if you're sensitive to treble instruments. And those who want a little bit more air or clarity, or the perceivedness of air and clarity, they might enjoy the R1 a little bit more than they would the NTH100, merely because the R1 has that emphasis in treble. Now, both headphones are closed back, as I mentioned, so neither produces a wide sound field or a wide soundstage. However, I think the NTH100's more restrained treble and mid-range forward balance tend to produce a presentation where I think it gives you a slightly wider soundstage than you might perceive on the R1. So imagine the HD6XX, which is a very, very popular headphone. If you take that in mind, then I would say that the NTH100 is about as wide as the HD6XX in soundstage, whereas the R1 is a little bit less wide than the HD6XX and therefore a little bit less wide than the NTH100. Now, what about the NDH20? Oh, these names, they're fantastic. The Neumann NDH20 I thought was a really good headphone when I originally compared it or reviewed it, and I had it for a couple years before I sold it and then rebought it, because one of my concerns about the NDH20 originally was that it was just very narrow. It gave you kind of a tunnel vision view of the music. It didn't have wide soundstage at all. It had suppressed treble region, which I thought was great, and it also simply sounded a little bit too muted. And then I rebought the NDH20 because I kind of missed that softer, more muted sound signature, and I really didn't have any other headphone in my collection at the time that could replicate the NDH20. Now, having said that, I think the NDH20 really gives you more or less a close approximation of a neutral sound signature, but it's not as neutral as the NDH100 or NTH100. And like I said, these names are fantastic. You can just never, ever confuse them. Now, the NDH20, the Neumann, compared to the R1, the bass, I think, on the NDH20 has kind of an elevated element to it. You know, it's not strictly neutral, and it's not necessarily as neutral as the NTH100 from Rode. But I think the elevation on the NDH20 is typically less pronounced than the R1. So the R1 is louder in the bass than the Neumann, but the Neumann is still a little bit louder than the Rode. But I don't think that distinction between the Rode and the Neumann is significant, maybe by a decibel or 2 decibels. In some instances, maybe 3 decibels. It's not significant. It's really hard to tell sometimes. But I think the transition between all these headphones is that the R1 is the loudest bass, then comes the Neumann, and then, not too far away from the Neumann, is the Rode. The mid-range on the Neumann is a little bit more obvious than on the R1. The R1, as I said previously, has that scoop in the middle because the bass and treble are elevated, whereas on the NDH20, the mid-range is more prevalent, more obvious in the R1. Vocals sound louder, instruments in the mid-range sound louder than they do on the R1. And again, this is because on the NDH20, the bass is not as elevated as it is on the R1. Now, the clarity in the mid-range, I think, is more obvious on the Rode NTH100 for part of the reason because the bass on the NTH100 is not as loud as that of the NDH20 and definitely not as loud as the R1. Now, when we come to the treble on the Neumann, I think it's audible, but as I mentioned previously just a few moments ago, the NDH20's treble is not particularly emphasized, and there's a decrease in the treble frequency, which could be very good, very pleasing for some, but it also doesn't add a whole lot of clarity or perceived clarity or air when you compare it against more neutral headphones, especially neutral in the treble region. So when I compare it against the R1, which has an elevation in the treble, there's basically a night and day difference between the two. And so compared to the NDH20, the R1 sounded more energetic, more clear in the treble, more perceived in the treble area. So details shot out more on the R1 than they do on the NDH20. Now, as for the soundstage, I've said this many times about the NDH20, its soundstage is pretty narrow. So in fact, it goes low on my soundstage scale that I used to use years ago. So it is far below the soundstage of the HD6XX. It's noticeably below the soundstage of the Rode NTH100. And yes, it is below the soundstage of the R1, though I think there's an argument to be made that the soundstage compared between the R1 and the NDH20 is similar. So they're at best similarly situated, about as wide as each other, but I think in reality, in my experience at least, the Neumann has a narrower soundstage. So, just recapping the whole thing, the Alo R1 does not introduce a new tuning philosophy, right? We talked about this already. It has a U-shaped sound that we've heard over and over and over and over again from a notoriously large number of audio companies and audiophile companies too. I'm not suggesting that the U-shaped response of the R1 is just like a Beats headphone, which, by the way, I understand if you don't like Beats, they do not sound good at all. So it's not as if the R1's sound signature is the same thing you would get on a Beats. I think there's a pretty significant difference between the two experiences. Beats has an overemphasis on bass, and they have an overemphasis on treble that it just becomes really aggravating to some people. Sibilance becomes really piercing on some tracks, and the mid-range, unless there's a ton of sparkle involved in the original recording of that mid-range, may sound scooped out in comparison, right? So the question really becomes, is the R1 a Beats ripoff, except just as expensive or more expensive, depending on which model of the Beats headphones you're getting? And the answer is no. They don't sound alike at all. I have one Beats studio headphone that's ancient at this point. I can't find it anymore, but I do remember its soundstage. I do remember its sound signature overall. And I can tell you from my recollection of that Beats headphone, it sounded muddy as hell, where the R1 does not. Having said that, the R1 is by no stretch of the imagination a neutral sounding headphone. It is not intended to give you a true sound of what you're recording. You should not be using this for mixing. In other words, if you're sitting in the booth controlling the audio track, mixing it, and you're wearing the R1, your mix will not sound the same as it will on the R1 compared to any other, say, more neutral headphone or speaker. I think it's pretty interesting to see something like this from Ollo Audio, which has not really delved into this sort of, aggressive U-shaped signature before. And it's nice to watch a company kind of evolve their sound signature and provide something different from the neutral brand that they've been promoting for years on end. But, I also have to be cognizant of the cost of this headphone. It's fairly expensive, and can you get a U-shaped sound signature for far less? The answer is absolutely. You absolutely can. And you don't need to spend all money for that specific type of sound signature. But on the flip side, you do get a very good headphone. You get fairly clean sound, despite the fact it's a U-shaped sound signature. You do get to hear details. It's not as muddy as, say, on Beats headphones. And it's not a dark sound like you might get, say, on a Sony MDR headphone that do sound pretty dark at times and don't provide the details that you may expect from a headphone, especially an audiophile class headphone. When we talk about the price to performance, look, spending about $500 or so for a U-shaped sound signature does sound like a lot of money. And I would not recommend the R1 for casual listeners. However, this headphone and all of Ollo's headphones are designed for professionals. And if you're a professional, if you're a music enthusiast who uses their gear often, if you're a creator, then I think the R1 might cater to you. Yes, it's expensive for a U-shaped sound signature, but you do get robust build, easily replaceable parts, good customer service, hand-built product. I mean, all those things do mount up to something that is potentially, arguably, worth the price tag. For casual listeners, I think you could probably just be fine with EQing neutral headphones so that it sounds to your taste. Or, in the alternative, you can find cheaper headphones that have a U-shaped sound signature, and there are countless number of those sorts of things flying around. Ultimately, in my view, I think the Ollo R1 is a really good headphone. I enjoyed my time with it, which is why I have this 30-minute long review, something I have done in a very, very long time. But it's hard for me to recommend it for the average consumer. However, I think it's a great product if you want to try Ollo Audio and you want this type of sound signature.